The crisp air of the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains settled over the country club ballroom. I stood quietly near the edge of my sister Celeste's engagement gala, a silent observer in my own family. Without warning, a leather folder was slid across the linen tablecloth directly into my hands. Inside was an invoice for $460,000. The multi-day luxury event was apparently now my financial burden, demanded immediately as a mandatory family contribution. I didn't gasp. I didn't shed a tear. I simply stared at the staggering figure printed in bold black ink. $460,000. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. For years, I had been the silent investor in Arthur and Margaret Hayes' version of family. They were my parents in name, but our relationship had always been a subscription model where I footed the bill. While Celeste enjoyed an unbroken stream of privilege, European vacations, designer wardrobes, and now this lavish gala, I had dedicated my life to dirt and grit. I ran a struggling wildlife sanctuary, pouring every cent I had into rehabilitating injured animals and, more importantly, caring for my young son, Leo. His medical bills were a mountain I climbed every single month. People often wonder why anyone stays in an exploitative arrangement. They assume it is weakness or a lack of self-respect. But the invisible chain of the survivor is forged from misplaced duty, not fragility. I endured the systemic marginalization because when you are the designated shock absorber for a dysfunctional family, you convince yourself that absorbing the impact is the only way to keep the structure from collapsing. I accepted the financial exploitation and emotional neglect because I believed silence was the premium I had to pay for peace. I thought if I just asked for less, they would eventually love me more. It was a terrible, quiet lie I told myself to survive the holidays. Leo's chronic respiratory illness had recently flared, coinciding with a critical ecological crisis at the sanctuary. We desperately needed emergency containment systems to save the endangered animals and protect my son's lungs from the damp mountain air. When I went to Arthur and Margaret 2 weeks ago, laying out the exact costs needed to keep my son breathing easily and my life's work afloat, they slammed the door in my face. They claimed their liquidity was tied up in complex investments. They told me I needed to be realistic about my little animal hobby. Yet here they were, squandering an absolute fortune on high society pageantry. This is the trap of normalized cruelty. In status-driven families, collective narcissism dictates the rules. Cruelty isn't seen as abuse. It is viewed as a normalized administrative duty. To them, starving my sanctuary and ignoring my son's health wasn't malice. It was simply reallocating resources away from a failed asset me toward their most profitable social venture, Celeste. They viewed cruelty as a necessary business practice to maintain their elite facade. And now, they expected me to finance my own exclusion, demanding I empty my life savings to cover their extravagant cocktail napkins and string quartets. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my mental ledger. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had spent 31 years paying into an account that yielded 0 returns. The debt they owed me wasn't just emotional, it was entirely structural. They weren't family, they were bad debt. And the ledger was finally closing. My hand moved methodically toward my purse. Inside rested a checkbook tied to the last remaining emergency savings meant for Leo's medical contingencies. I opened it, my mind calculating the exact cost of liquidating everything I owned to sever this contract with my parents permanently. I was ready to execute the transaction, to buy my permanent freedom and walk out of this ballroom forever. But before my pen touched the paper, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, heavy thud that stopped the string quartet mid-note. The music stopped. The chatter of Virginia's elite evaporated into absolute silence. Standing in the threshold was Eleanor Hayes. At 89 years old, my grandmother, the formidable matriarch and original architect of the family's real estate empire, commanded the room without speaking a single word. She walked with a silver-tipped cane, her posture unyielding, her gaze sweeping over the crowd like a judge surveying a guilty courtroom. Everyone parted for her. Eleanor had always been a silent observer of my parents' shallow ambitions. For decades, she bore the silent regret of the watchman. Observers often think silence equals complicity, but for a matriarch watching her own legacy curdle into toxic vanity, silence is a heavy, suffocating torment. She had stayed quiet, hoping Arthur and Margaret would eventually find their moral compass, hoping the rot wouldn't reach the core of the empire she had built from nothing. But standing by while a dynasty decays is a burden that eventually breaks the silent observer. She chose this exact public moment to intervene because a cancer allowed to grow in the dark can only be eradicated by dragging it into the blinding light. She had waited for them to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that they were beyond saving. Eleanor reached my table and looked down at the invoice resting next to my checkbook. Her eyes darkened with absolute fury. She turned to face Arthur and Margaret, who were suddenly scrambling forward, their polished social smiles melting into genuine, unadulterated panic. Arthur. Margaret. Eleanor's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, sharp as cracked ice. You will not extort another dime from this woman. My mother stammered, attempting to pass it off as a joke, reaching out to touch Eleanor's arm. Eleanor cut her off, stepping back in disgust. I have watched you parade around this town, trading on the Hayes name while behaving like parasites. You denied your own grandson medical safety to fund this circus, and now you demand she pays for it? The crowd watched, paralyzed, as the untouchable Hayes facade cracked open for all to see. I have contacted my attorneys, Eleanor announced, her voice cold and definitive, leaving no room for negotiation. The family trust is being rewritten tonight. Arthur, Margaret, Celeste, you are entirely disinherited. Effective immediately, you will not receive a single cent of the empire I built. I watched my parents age a decade in 3 seconds. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that the audit had finally arrived and that I had stopped playing along. Within the hour, the gala was behind us. I sat across from Eleanor in the heavy leather chairs of her study at the ancestral estate, the smell of old paper and polished wood surrounding us. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it was incredibly honest. She didn't offer apologies or tearful embraces. She simply opened her briefcase and handed me a thick, heavy manila folder. I have pancreatic cancer, Eleanor stated matter-of-factly, adjusting her glasses. The doctors give me a few months, perhaps less. That diagnosis forced my hand, Arya. It expedited the audit of our family's financials. I didn't panic or cry. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the heavily highlighted bank records, transfer statements, and property deeds. What I found wasn't just evidence of emotional neglect. It was documented white-collar crime, laid out in black and white. Arthur and Margaret had not merely ignored my requests for help with Leo's medical bills. They had systematically embezzled $1.8 million from a protected land grant trust left directly to me by my biological grandfather. Because they were named as the initial trustees, they had spent the last decade forging my signature on deferment documents, illegally retaining control of the account long after I turned 21. The numbers aligned perfectly. Every withdrawal matched a major purchase for Celeste's lifestyle. But the final, lethal discovery was the deed to the very equestrian estate where Celeste had just been celebrating her engagement. The down payment for that property was wired directly from my stolen trust funds. Family snobbery had crossed the line into felony embezzlement, and they had left a paper trail a mile wide. As I reviewed the ledgers, I saw the stark reality of what would have happened. In a world without Eleanor, total financial and psychological erosion would have consumed me. If the matriarch had not intervened, my parents' systematic draining of my resources would have been absolute. They would have legally bled my grandfather's trust dry, leaving me completely bankrupt, my sanctuary foreclosed, and my son without his critical medical containment. The counterfactual reality was terrifying, not because I was weak, but because fighting an enemy who controls the legal and financial narrative from the shadows is an unwinnable war for a single, isolated target. They would have suffocated me financially while smiling for the cameras. They stole your foundation to build a stage for your sister, Eleanor said, her voice like grinding stone. I have secured every document. The lawyers are ready. The district attorney is ready. This was the criminal twist that removed any possibility of redemption. My parents had transformed my biological inheritance into their personal checking account. Love was a contract they had breached, and revenge was simply accounting. Are the emergency injunctions ready to be filed? I asked, my voice completely steady, analyzing the legal documents in front of me. Eleanor nodded, tapping her cane on the floor. First thing Monday morning. By the time they wake up, they'll be locked out of everything. There was no hesitation. I picked up my phone to dial the attorney. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. The time for familial loyalty was over. The era of strict accountability had begun. I had been the silent partner for too long. It was time for a hostile takeover. The digital collapse happened faster than a wildfire in dry brush. By Monday morning, news of the matriarch's altered will and the frozen bank accounts had leaked to the regional press, sending absolute shockwaves through Virginia's elite circles. My phone remained silent. I had blocked my parents' and sisters' numbers the moment the assets were legally frozen. I didn't need to hear their panic or listen to their frantic bargaining. I was already tracking their destruction in real time, watching the data roll in. Desperate to salvage her crumbling social standing and secure her wealthy fiancé's commitment before he realized the family was broke, Celeste went on the offensive. She booked a highly publicized interview on a popular regional lifestyle and high society podcast. She intended to paint our family as the tragic victims of an ungrateful, unstable outcast who had manipulated a dying, confused elderly woman out of her fortune. I sat in my sanctuary office, the live stream playing on my monitor, my hands steepled on the desk. I watched impassively as Celeste wore a simple, unbranded sweater, trying desperately to look relatable and devastated. My sister was always troubled, she told the host, wiping away a perfectly timed, non-existent tear. My parents gave her everything, but she isolated herself. Now she's taking advantage of our grandmother's declining mental state to steal what belongs to the whole family. The host, however, was not just a society reporter looking for soft gossip. He was a veteran media shark who had received the leaked public court filings my attorney had submitted that very morning. "That's an interesting perspective, Celeste," the host said, leaning into his microphone with a hard stare. "But public records filed today show a very different story. Can you explain the origin of the funds used to purchase your new equestrian estate? Specifically, the $1.8 million transferred from your sister's protected land grant trust?" Celeste froze. The broadcast captured the exact millisecond her carefully constructed facade shattered. She stammered, her eyes darting off camera, searching for a PR rep who couldn't save her. That money was family money. It was meant for the family. The trust was explicitly in Aria Hayes' name, the host pressed relentlessly. "Did your parents embezzle those funds to buy your property?" The pressure snapped her completely. Celeste lost all composure. Her face contorted with unhinged rage, and she screamed into the microphone, broadcasting her malice to millions of viewers. "We earned that money. We had to deal with her dragging our family name through the mud with her dirty animals and her sick kid. She owed us for putting up with her. We deserved every cent." The live chat beside the video feed exploded with outrage. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply took a screenshot of the exact moment she confessed to a felony on a live broadcast. They had wanted public attention to control the narrative. Now, they had the attention of the entire state, the district attorney, and a jury of their peers. The accounting was almost complete, and they had just handed me the final receipt. The ensuing legal battle was not a war. It was a swift, clinical execution. Armed with Eleanor's meticulous documentation and Celeste's disastrous live-streamed confession, our attorneys moved with absolute precision. The court proceedings took less than a month, a blur of injunctions, asset seizures, and irrefutable evidence. Arthur and Margaret sat at the defense table looking like hollowed-out shells of the socialites they once were. When the judge delivered the final ruling, stripping them of their executive board positions, removing their access to the Hayes real estate empire, and ordering the immediate liquidation of their remaining assets to repay the stolen trust funds, they didn't even fight back. The criminal investigation into the embezzled trust funds moved forward in tandem, shifting their future from exclusive country clubs to federal courtrooms. Julian, Celeste's wealthy corporate heir fiancé, quietly broke the engagement and vanished within 48 hours of the broadcast, erasing the last shred of their social capital. I watched my parents lose everything they held dear. I watched them beg the judge for leniency, claiming they had simply made poor administrative choices under pressure, but I felt nothing. Their untouchable social facade collapsed entirely under the weight of its own documented corruption. Watching their empire turn to dust was a masterclass in the illusion of power of an empty wallet. There is a profound psychological difference between material having and internal being. My parents and sister had spent their lives equating their self-worth with the balance in their accounts and the exclusivity of their zip codes. They possessed no internal identity, no foundational character, and no actual substance. Therefore, when you strip away the optics, the money, the estates, the designer labels the status built purely on financial leverage disintegrates instantly. They didn't just lose their wealth, they lost their existence. Without their money, they were nothing but ghosts in expensive, outdated clothes. The gavel came down. The judgment was final. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. My father called my name, his voice echoing in the marble hallway, begging for a moment of my time, begging for mercy. "We're your parents, Arya," he pleaded, grabbing my sleeve. "You can't just leave us with nothing." I pulled my arm away, my expression completely neutral, viewing him as a finalized spreadsheet. "You weren't shocked by what you did," I told him, my voice carrying the cold finality of a closed account. "You were only shocked that I stopped paying the premium to keep your secrets. This isn't revenge, it is an audit, and your balance is zero." I pushed through the double doors and walked into the crisp Virginia air, leaving them behind to face their ruin. The local newspapers ran the story on the front page the next morning. I read the headline while sipping my morning coffee, feeling no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a successfully balanced equation. The systemic abuse that had defined my life for 3 decades had been dismantled, litigated, and settled. My phone did not ring. No one demanded a contribution. My family was bankrupt, legally and morally, and I was finally in the black. Months later, the Virginia breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. I stood in my new office, looking out through expansive glass windows at the newly expanded Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. The hum of construction had long faded, replaced by the sounds of rehabilitated wildlife and the steady, easy breathing of my son, Leo. Thanks to the recovered funds and the medical trust established in his name, his health was finally secure. I stood in absolute, unbroken peace, watching the world I had built with my own hands. Using my reclaimed resources, I had established the Eleanor Hayes Ecological Trust. It was fully funded, providing permanent protection for endangered mountain habitats and offering robust medical support grants for children and families facing medical isolation. I had realized that true victory requires redefining the endgame entirely. This was the justice of the planter. Punitive revenge is a fire that burns the ground, leaving nothing but ash, but constructive legacy building is planting a forest over that very ash. Stripping my toxic family of their power was merely clearing the dead brush. The real triumph was using their stolen resources to cultivate life, safety, and healing for those who truly needed it. I had transformed their legacy of theft and vanity into an empire of giving and growth. The expansion of the sanctuary allowed us to take in twice as many rescues. Every time I signed a check to fund a new enclosure or approve a medical grant for a struggling family, I thought of my grandmother. Eleanor didn't live to see the trust fully operational. She passed away peacefully 2 months after the trial, but her final act of clarity made all of this possible. She gave me the capital to execute my vision, and I honored her by ensuring the Hayes name would be associated with preservation, not exploitation. The noise of their downfall had faded from my life completely. I didn't care where Arthur, Margaret, or Celeste ended up, or what cheap apartments they were forced to rent. My ledger was balanced. My sanctuary was thriving. I watched Leo chase a butterfly, his laughter echoing across the ridge. I felt a profound sense of closure. The coldness that had driven me through the litigation had melted into something warm and enduring. I've come to realize that holding on to anger, even justified anger, is just another way of letting them write your story. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not mean access. You can forgive someone while changing the locks and walking away forever. To anyone listening who has ever felt like an outcast in their own home, to anyone who has been made to feel like a burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, I see you. The pain of not belonging to your own blood is a profound, quiet grief that takes years to understand. But cutting toxic ties is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound courage. Your worth is not determined by people who are too broken to value you. You have the power to draw a line, to say enough, and to build a new family out of peace, boundaries, and unconditional love. You do not have to endure the cold just because they are standing near the fire. You can build your own warmth. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment sharing your own thoughts. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.